From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You're listening to the Big Ideas Podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Jolie Sheffer, Professor of English and American Culture Studies and the Director of ICS. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp in the lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Odawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts toward decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who've been living and working on this land from time immemorial. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jade Power-Sotomayor and Dr. Amy Rose Forbes-Erickson. This episode considers how dance can be a means to foster connection, create community, and express cultural resistance and resilience. Dr. Jade Power-Sotomayor is an assistant professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of California, San Diego. Her research focuses on Latinx theater and performance, the intersections between race, gender, and language, and on intercultural performance in the Latin Caribbean diaspora. Dr. Amy Rose Forbes-Erickson is an assistant professor of theater and performance studies in the Department of Theater and Film at Bowling Green State University. She specializes in theater history, performance studies, historiography, and dramatic literature of the Caribbean. She's also the founder of the Pan-African Theater Ensemble, PATE, at BGSU. Thanks so much for joining me today. Jade and Amy Rose, you both have done a lot of research that touches on how performance and dance in the Caribbean function to express community and resistance. To start, could each of you tell us a bit about the specific performance or dance forms you study and how you got interested in them? Jade, will you kick it off?
Sure. Thank you for having us. And I want to say that I've always been a dancer. We start dancing oftentimes in the house, oftentimes amongst friends, also in studio spaces. I was disciplined through particular practices that I was never really great at. But that aside, that was, sort of an earlier trajectory. One of the forms of dance that I write about, and I would say that really kind of inspires my larger project in thinking not just about dance, but in thinking about what I call the speaking body, came through the Afro-Puerto Rican practice of bomba, which is a music and dance form that is somewhere between 400 and 500 years old. It is the oldest extant, still in existence music from the archipelago of Puerto Rico, which is where I spent my early childhood and my ancestral homeland. And so I had seen bomba performed on stage, folkloric festivals, understood it as a signifier of a particular past. But it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I saw bomba danced in a batey space, in more of a social setting. But I saw this dance in the batey and saw this conversation happening with the dancer and the drummer. And I saw this incredible expressive power coming from the dancer. I saw these invisible but very apparent lines of connection between the dancer's movements and the drummer's response. And I thought to myself, I want to do that. And so I found opportunities to learn, and this was at a time where there was a lot of energy in the Puerto Rican diaspora around learning this form, not just as a choreographic practice, but as a practice of, sort of repopularizing it and bringing it into kind of social spaces. And, as part of the process of learning something that I loved and that was fun and that brought me, my very favorite people in the world into my life, and cemented relationships, not just to people, but to histories and to memories. I also realized that many of the questions that I was asking in my own doctoral research were in fact happening in the space of the batey and in this relationship between the dancer and the drummer. So that's that's one of the forms that kind of, I feel in many ways, was the entryway to my larger project.
And what about for you, Amy Rose? Talk to us about one or more of the forms that have influenced you and how you got interested in that as a particular site for study.
So my research is very broad at the moment. It's performance study and a historical survey of Caribbean masquerades from the 17th century to the early 21st century. And when I talk about masquerade, I'm talking about an umbrella term that includes carnivals and parades and spectacles. And I'd say, kind of like Jade, I kind of grew up around going to a carnival or being in a parade or having some aspect, whether I'm going to be designing something or I'm going to be performing in it. And so it's so much a part of me. And I actually see histories in various forms of masquerades. And so I became interested in a Caribbean history broadly and seeing masquerades as palimpsests because, like a 400-year history of the bomba, we have right across the Caribbean. Carnival has that long history, and it's performed like every year. And every year you would either have a new character coming up, but very often it's going to be the same traditional character, but in different contexts and recontextualized. And so I really like to read about and study a kind of performance that happens over that period of time as palimpsests, because I think that that's how we know our history. I've also been to carnivals outside of the Caribbean. So, having studied in London, having been to the Notting Hill Carnival, having some experience, of course, living in Trinidad for a year with Carnival. I have a real appreciation of immigrant groups outside of the Caribbean and how we've sort of carried this performance with us and what that really means.
Both of you are talking about dance forms that really are shaped by or in relationship and resistance to a history of colonialism and other forms of violence. Could each of you talk a little bit about the ways in which those forms, bomba or the masquerade, illustrate that tension between the self-creative and the resistance to that kind of domination?
I want to underscore what Amy Rose has just said about the palimpsest and and then looking to the sort of how we engage with the concept of resistance. And I think it's important, particularly in this day and age. It's a word we use a lot. It's a word we think we know what it means. It's a word I use a lot, and think about. But at the same time, I think it's important to think about, first of all, what are we resisting? And how, right? And in what ways is something resistant? And I think in terms of how bomba is resisting, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, I think festivity is a dangerous concept, right? Because in the concept of festivity, we also sort of get the sort of production of the primitive, oh, so happy, not bothered figure that then reifies their ability to withstand all the hardship, right? And at the same time, joy, right, that comes with festivity is indeed a refusal. It's indeed a type of refusal. And at the same time, for instance, with the history of bomba has been written about its connection to, throughout the 19th century, its connection to insurrection, the planning of insurrection. We know there's a long history with Black dances, period, across the Americas and rebellion. And we know that this connection happens because of the space, the gathering that happens around the dance. So there is a way in which there's a restoration of humanity amongst systems that rely on dehumanization. That I think is resistive in that manner. I also, specifically to bomba, as it's developed over the last 100 years, the bomba dance language, as we've seen the kind of the crystallization of a very precise relationship between the drumming and the dancing. And when I say that, I'm referring to kind of how contemporary bomba has a very tight relationship between the drum and dance that would have, sort of earlier in the 20th century, what we know is it was more generalized, right? It was there, but it wasn't quite down to every quarter note, right? Or, to every single gesture. And that's something that has developed in really beautiful and important ways, and in part because of its time on the stage. But I think that in that relationship, we have the kind of the language for and the space for a relationship of listening and a relationship of communication that turns inward and toward each other, and that looks for a kind of sort of self-sovereignty, right? A kind of ownership of oneself that isn't dependent on recognition from a colonial state, that isn't dependent on some outside source bestowing you your humanity, but rather that is dependent on your co-collaborators, right? And it's not but it's also not something that you just do individually. It's something that you rely on each other to make together.
And how does that work in terms of some of the masquerades that you study, Amy Rose?
So, I wanted to say that not all festivities and not all parades were generated, I'd say, from enslaved peoples. I think that came a little bit later on. So, for example, like in Jamaica with Jamaican masquerades, there is a very, very troubling sort of masquerade of the brown girls' balls from the late 18th century going into the early 19th century, where brown women, and when we say brown women, they'd be La Mulata is the term, but also mulatto woman or mulatress. That's a woman who is both African and European, just to clarify. And so during slavery, these women were actually brought to a sort of like masquerade ball, and it was for the ruling British Navy. And they were really put on a sort of display. The brown women went onto the streets and started parading, and they did not actually do this themselves. It was like an enforced sort of masquerade. If you think of masquerade as being a form of liberation, it was not a kind of liberation in this sense. So the women were, they were out in the street, and then they were put in sets by the shade of their skin. And the plantation wives, the mistresses, the plantation wives, would sponsor with finery and jewelry. And it's, Jamaica has such a history of this. It's just, to me, very troubling. And that's where I was like, I could not believe when I started looking it up, how entrenched it was within the culture. And then, so the women parading in sets, they were called set girls. And then, of course, because it was during slavery, even though they were doing these performances, they weren't doing it of their own will. So they started disrupting, going out of the order, and they were just, disrupted. Well, one year, late 19th century, the people erupted and had a major riot. Nobody wanted to do it anymore. But somehow it emerged again, not in the form of set girls, but in the form of dance hall, a contemporary form. It's not a dance so much as a lifestyle and a culture and a sort of movement. But the most interesting thing about it is back in the 90s, this idea of the skin color came back. But it came back among Black working class women who, I believe, in a satirical way, started like lightening their skin to say, well, we're dark skinned and we can't get a job, or we're dark skinned and we can't move up in life, in society. And they decided that they're going to start lightening their skin. But it's only in the context of the performance in dance hall. But I think that kind of resistance came afterwards, like post-slavery, when people started to really, agitate towards freedom and agitate towards their independence, that a more kind of satirical performance came, where they were critiquing the historical colorism within the society.
You both are really getting at the way that these performance traditions cite the body as a site of knowledge and meaning making, but in distinct ways. So, Jade, you talk in your research about bomba as choreosonic. Can you talk a bit about how that applies here and kind of some of the ways in which the individual body or the body in its relationship to the music really does not only like perform, but is creating meaning for audiences?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I was inspired by Sean Crawley's use of the concept choreosonic in his book Black Pentecostal Breath. So Crawley writes about how the sonic comprises the choreographic and the choreographic comprises the sonic. And, you can see that in many Afro-diasporic traditions, the way that the dancer is absolutely the lead sonic voice, right, is amplifying their movements through a sonic impact. It not only requires an attention to where and how their bodies are fitting into the music, but it also allows for an articulation of something that comes up from them, right? So it's both about locking in and stepping into time with and being with what's already there at the same time that one can release what they have inside. And release can be both like a cathartic release and a creative release, right? And something that tells a story. I think bomba serves in this way as an example, right? As a case study for what do we have to learn when we are able to think music and dance together, but also storytelling, right? And also all of it, that it's one is not extractable from the other, and that it's the same logic of cordoning and containment that actually allows for cordoning and containment of these, racial differences and gender differences. And so that in thinking of them as, intermeshed, that we also kind of start to undo the sort of logics of anti-Blackness, the logics of colonialism in and of themselves.
Hmm. Amy Rose, for you, and thinking about masquerades or dance hall, how do you think about that relationship between music and dance and the body as kind of this mediating site for that?
So, like Jade, I would say I tend to use the term performance or masquerade broadly to include music, to include dance, to include visual culture. And if I make any specific references to things, and I would make a specific references to what form of masquerade it is, I believe that performance is embodied already of itself. I am actually really thinking of Caribbean performance or Caribbean masquerade as an everyday experience, meaning that everything about Caribbean life is masquerade and masquerade is Caribbean. That's just how it is. I think that as a people, we collectively perform and collectively resist. I don't see masquerade, even though you could masquerade as an individual, it's much more. I think when people get together, there's something that happens where people understand like the codes and all the various symbols, they understand the history. I think that as a people, it's almost as if you can actually see the past and the present and some sort of future all in that event. So yes, I don't really make the distinctions between let's say music or dance in that sense. If I talk about it, I'm going to talk about it as some kind of embodied performance and a masquerade in and of itself.
We're going to take a quick break. Thanks for listening to the Big Ideas podcast.
Question. Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Welcome back to the Big Ideas podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Jade Power-Sotomayor and Dr. Amy Rose Forbes-Erickson about dance performance and cultural resistance in the Caribbean. One of the things that both of you are really making me think about is the ways in which kind of Western culture and certainly like academic discourse so prioritizes the written word that things like music, dance, performance, masquerade really go under recognized as forms of meaning making, of communication, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about how you see yourself as a scholar trying to kind of correct that erasure?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a complicated endeavor precisely because many of these practices are illegible. And so it can feel like a practice of trying to translate them, which can feel like a betrayal of the knowledge systems themselves because they are embodied and because they are so something that, is collectively created in a time and in a place. But at the same time, I also, so I sort of personally vacillate between understanding the necessity of putting this into the archive in a way that places it in there alongside everything else at the same time that I understand that does not exist in a hierarchy, or that is not somehow what is lending importance to the practice itself. I want us to be able to see the practice itself as its own archive and as something that we look to for how to access the knowledge. And it's complicated, right? Doing research in and teaching in performance studies because we recognize embodiment and we recognize embodied knowledge as something that is developed alongside and because ways that certain bodies and people have been denied access to these other forms of knowledge, but also that exist in a hierarchical relationship to it, right? So it's always a balance between how can we do both of these at the same time, which is why I feel it is important to continue to develop a practice for me and to listen to practitioners and to privilege them as the knowers. And even when what they say may or may not fit into a discourse that we popularly believe in academia or something along those lines.
Yes, I so agree with what Jade said about privileging the people. So when I am approaching my research and I'm looking in colonial archives and I'm looking at how Europeans or Westerners had analyzed the performance, and I'm like, oh my God, they got that so wrong. And so I spend a lot of time trying to reinterpret the archives. That's why I'd say a lot of my interest and research really, it's right back in the 17th century because I feel like I need to correct and to sort of reinterpret. And like when I talk about the brown women doing this kind of performance who could not speak, I mean, there are lyrics to songs of them pleading for their freedom. And a colonial writer would look at that and go, "Oh, they're happy. They're happy, or they're singing and they're dancing, but they're singing. If you listen to the lyrics, they're saying something more." So I spend a lot of time like really going through those archives, trying to reinterpret, trying to sort of speak for those people who could not speak for themselves. And I so agree with what Jade said about privileging those voices.
We've seen a stunning rise in global musical forms being incorporated into popular musical forms. And, everything from hip hop and pop, electronic dance music and reggaeton, all now kind of fusing together different influences from around the world. Do you see some of these examples of absorption into the mainstream as a force for change in the music industry and in kind of those dominant modes? Or are you worried about a kind of watering down of some of the culturally specific forms for the marketplace? And feel free to kind of give specific examples to the positive or the negative.
I actually think it's a good thing to have this sort of syncretism. We can't really control or contain how music and how collaboration is going to happen. I think if it comes down to like an archival research, of course, you want to make sure that you're preserving something of bombast somewhere, that people will know that this is, at least at this time, this is what bomba was. But at some point, it will continue to evolve, even though you do have that source. I would say the same thing for something like reggae that turned out to dance hall, that turned into reggaeton. People are moving. And with that movement, with the migration, of course, you're going to have your syncretism. I'm really excited to see the growth, really, the development of Black music and how that, across the diaspora, we have very different musical forms, but they're all coming from this same place. So for me, I think it's a positive. And we also have different mainstreams. So we tend to think of like there's one mainstream, but we actually have several different mainstreams. It's great that Black artists, for example, can have their own record company with artists like, I don't know, Beyonce and others like that, having control over the producing of the music, maybe even adding something from Afrobeat on the continent of Africa. Black artists can travel anywhere in the world now and be known for what they're doing. And I'm sure possibly the same for Latin music. We've always had this kind of syncretism, and I think it's actually quite good.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great response. One of the things about bomba that's interesting, and then I actually want to say something about reggaeton. One of the things about bomba that's interesting is that it continues to be kind of more popular, but it is kind of difficult to commercialize, partly because it really, in order to make it, you really need all the pieces of it. You need the drums, you need the dancers, you need this, and the experience itself is in being there, right? It isn't necessarily in watching it as much or as in like listening to it. It's also difficult to record because of the deep sounding drums. Reggaeton, which comes from reggae, comes from dance hall through Panama, explodes in Puerto Rico and then goes on to Colombia and is now the most popular music in the world. And to be clear, a lot of what we call Latin music is Black music, right? Salsa is Black music, cumbia is Black music, reggaeton is Black music. So there's a particular sort of global trafficking of this. But as Amy Rose says, culture is going to do its own thing. But there's a way in which culture is trafficked, right? There's a way in which it moves not disattached from capital, right? So it's more than just about appropriation or not appropriation. I think that that's kind of in many ways an important but oftentimes a dead end argument. But like, what are the different forms of capital that are attached to it? And what does this mean in terms of our deeper understanding of Black history, our deeper understanding of, how power circulates. But I think it is incredible the way it's disruptive force, right? So the way that, for instance, reggaeton, and I'm also writing about perreo, that's sort of accompanying dance form, as, this disruption of the politics of respectability on a global level, right? Even though we've had this around forever. But what does it mean to have, in terms of in this moment where, there's a lot of exploration and articulation about femicide and about gendered expression and about kind of ownership of self through body. What does it mean to have this form be the vehicle for that? And I think that and it's always going to be both things, right? To quote the wonderful Jamaican philosopher Sylvia Wynter and her work around the plot and the plantation, the plot that lives within the plantation and is comprised by, right? You can't have one without the other, right? But there are constantly sort of forces that pull at each other.
I think one of the things that both of you are doing, as we've discussed, is really helping to bring attention and voice to forms and communities that are really underrepresented, like certainly within higher education and the academy. What advice do you give to students who are thinking about kind of things they want to study that they don't see represented in their own education? How would you encourage them to kind of find their own voice and to kind of help to create those archives of the things that have historically kind of been overlooked?
Yeah, well, I would say that, I often tell students, if there's something that you love, go into that, because chances are if you love it, you know something about it. And if you love it, you want to know more about it. And so that's what I tell folks is to really lean into the things that make them feel something, and then keep digging and to see, why. And then you'll get into history, and you'll get into close analysis of the object itself. And so I think there's just a lot of places you can take it, but it's also about, if there's something that moves you that you're like, why isn't anybody else talking about it? Then clearly you are the person that needs to talk about it because you've noticed it. Wherever you're standing means that you have a particular perspective on that that's important.
I agree. I think also, you have to follow your passion. I tell students to follow their passion. Maybe find a professor in the field, somebody they could go talk to and say, look, I'm interested in this. Join a club, an interest group, some kind of organization. Take a course, go study abroad, travel overseas to a country, a place where the culture is alive there, where they can really experience it. Yeah, I'd say that's the way to go. Just follow your dream and follow your passion.
Anything else either of you would like to add that we haven't touched on yet?
Thank you for great questions.
Thank you so much. This was great.
This was my pleasure. Thank you for joining me today, Jade and Amy Rose. Listeners can keep up with ICS happenings by following us on Twitter and Instagram at ICS BGSU and on our Facebook page. You can listen to Big Ideas wherever you find your favorite podcast. Please subscribe and rate us on your preferred platform. For more information or to suggest a topic for future episodes, visit bgsu.edu/BG Ideas. Our producers for this podcast are Chris Cavera and Marco Mendoza. Sound engineering today was provided by Indigo Palti and Deanna McKeegan, with sound editing by Deanna McKeegan and Marco Mendoza. Research assistance for this episode was provided by Joanna Simpson.